I want to welcome you to this conversation on leadership. I'm Ed Baker. I serve as director of the North Carolina Institute for Public Health here at the University of North Carolina School of Public Health in Chapel Hill. And this is the first such conversation as part of a new program that's designed to equip people to be leaders in public health. And we're very fortunate to have with us today Dr. Leah Devlin, our colleague and friend who directs the North Carolina Division of Public Health and was recently elected to be president of the Association of State and Territorial Health Officials, the national organization that represents state health directors. What we're going to do today is to walk through a series of questions, and then we'll have time for discussion later on. So Leah, thank you for doing this.
I'm happy to be here. Thank you.
The first thing that we are wondering about has to do with the issue of role models and mentors and people that have influenced you along the way, particularly when you got started. And I understand you have some very significant people in your life that have influenced you along the way to become the leader that you are today. Could you say a little bit more about that?
Well, I'd be glad to. I guess from my earliest years on, it's almost a cliche, but my father was a basketball coach, and I learned as a very small child in the gym all the lessons of teamwork and having a goal and focusing on the prize, working hard, respecting everybody's role on the team. And it was just a good learning environment in that way. And he was also very innovative and a risk taker, created the first sports camp in the whole country and created a piece of equipment back before weightlifting where people could learn to rebound very well. So he was a big influence on me. And then as I moved on into my career, there were many people that have had impacts, but one would be Dr. Ron Levine, who was the state health officer for North Carolina for 17 years. And at the local level, I got to watch him making health policy, working with the legislature. He was always evidence-based. That was his big thing, is attention to detail and don't get off the science or you're in murky water. Those were good lessons. He also had lessons on longevity and how you go the distance over a rocky road and have an impact. Those were good lessons. And I guess most recently, Mary Selecki, who is the state health officer in Washington State, but she has served as my official mentor. We have actually an official mentoring program at ASTO, and it was really great to have a leader that had done a lot at the national level and could share those stories. It was also nice that she was a woman fighting the fight for public health, so that was really helpful too.
Well, we're hoping you'll stay maybe 17 years or even longer in this position that you're in.
Oh, thank you.
It's been great for us.
Thank you.
What about just stepping back, some general thoughts about leadership? You've mentioned 3 people, and you've touched on this already, but what attributes do you think are particularly important in determining effectiveness? You're in a leadership position right now. A lot of what you do every day really is about affecting change, about doing things that really make a difference in the lives of people. What sort of attributes do you think are particularly important from all of this?
I think that one point would be developing the art of the long view, and there's actually a book. I've taken a fair amount of leadership training, and we read this book called The Art of the Long View, which talks about, you know, having your vision, having a focus, don't let today's agenda take away from where you're trying to go with your organization and the services that you're providing. So I would say the long view and focus. And then it's very important to build your team and your partnerships because you're not going to get it done by yourself. So that's the other thing that's very important. And underlying all that you do has got to be communications, to be able to articulate where you're going to go and how others can help you and why your work is important and what you hope to achieve. So that's communications is essential.
What would be a couple of situations, maybe specific things that you've been involved in recently that you could share that sort of illustrate some of those basic points, things that you've really worked on where you've put those principles into practice? What would be a couple of examples?
One example that comes to mind is building a school health initiative. That's something that I've been interested in for over 20 years. The fact that we send children off to school every day and we don't know that it's a healthy environment or healthy foods or that they're going to have the services there they need to manage their health or protect their health. So many factors there. So we have embarked on a long-term strategic plan to build a healthy school program for children, and we believe that that is something that is critical to their success in school and ultimately their success in life. We've begun to partner very closely with our education community, helping them understand that we're not just about healthy children, that we want children to be successful in school just like they do, that the goal is the same. So we've reached out to the Department of Public Instruction, we've reached out to our local boards of health, but our boards of education as well, parents, many stakeholders, in building the momentum, educating the governor, the legislature, and we have been very successful in creating new policies around fitness, around what's served in school, as well as putting real resources into school nurses so that children have that resource for them at school too. We've actually were funded for about 145 new nurses last year, and this year there'll be another 150. So we're building momentum, and I think that that's taken a long approach.
Now, in that particular example, I know you've done things internal within the Division of Public Health to really address that issue of school health. And you've also mentioned just now working externally. And could you say a little bit more about your role as a leader? Because you have an internal role within the division. You have a very large number of people. I've forgotten exactly how many that work in the division, where you have this internal leadership role. But also you're doing things externally. How do those things play off against each other? Because you do both of those things in your current position.
Well, there is an inside and an outside game for sure, and it really sometimes you work one against the other and they're both working you, so it is important to keep the communications open. We had to build interest in school health on the inside. It was not a natural, oh, we've got to do that. There are some that would argue that's a personal health service, or that's not as population-based as we should be. So we had to overcome some ideology. We had to deal with resources that might go for traditional programs we'd been providing resources to, and say, okay, well, yes, we need to do that, but we've got to move on. This is an important unmet need. So we did have to talk with a lot of leaders within the division. We also had to develop this notion of team around school health. We had our oral health staff looking at the teeth. We had physical activity and nutrition concerned about their issues. So we had to pull everybody together. We created an internal school matrix team. We gave it a new name, a new entity. We said this is everybody's business. This is a priority for the division, for the department, for the community, and we are going to look back in 10 years and say, we did that and we've made progress, and it's because of you, and it's because of your leadership within the division. So we pulled resources and expertise and we made it a priority inside before we went out. And then outside, you have to do it all over again. Why it is important for other partners and stakeholders.
Do you think there's a different skill set in terms of the internal role versus the external? The external you've described about partnerships, bringing people together. The internal, you talked about creating teams. Do you feel that there's a difference there, or is it part of the same sort of process?
Internally, I guess we talk more about teams and team building, and outside we get to the partnership and the collaboration. It does get a little more tenuous outside because you have less control. Either way, you're relying on relationships and communications, and even if it's someone that you directly supervise, when you're in the governmental system, and I think it's getting more and more that way in the private sector too, it's all about the relationship and helping to find common ground and common goals, see the vision, and understand the needs of each of the stakeholders, whether it's internal or external, to see themselves in it and how they can contribute to a part of the solution, why it's important.
You mentioned Mary Selecki earlier. She's a person that I have a lot of respect for. I heard her once say, relationships are everything, all else is derivative.
Right.
And I think that's part of what you're saying.
That's right.
It's that kind of thing. One of the internal issues has to do with direct reports and, relating to those people that report to you. I've been very impressed since coming to North Carolina with the team that you put together, the folks that report to you directly. If you could you say a little bit more about what you look for in selecting people to be really your direct reports, your team that you work with every day? It's a little different from the team you talked about earlier, where you're putting a group together for a particular purpose. But these are the people that you work with all the time. They're some relatively small number there. What do you look for in those individuals?
Well, first they have to be leaders in their own field. They've got to be knowledgeable. So I look for content expertise, also an understanding of the role of public health and how that plays out in the quality of life of the community. Also innovation and being able to think, well, why not, instead of, well, why? So that's very important as well. I need to be able to hand off the ball and they take it and they go with it. And I then look for them to be sure that I'm kept informed so that we have a lot of synergy. So we do have a great team in the Division of Public Health, and I'm only going to be as good as they are. So I'm very grateful for their work, and I hope that I take time to tell them that. And I also look for someone that has communication skills. Mm-hmm. But not everybody has to have all of these attributes. I mean, we are a team, and there is value in one team member that likes to read all the journals and make sure we all have the most recent, business review article on health or something like that. So we complement each other in some of these attributes.
Now, each of us has had a slightly different experience. That is, that one person that doesn't work out. That's the more difficult side of this. Could you say a little bit about how you have approached that particular situation? Because I think for people that are emerging leaders that are coming into positions, how one handles that situation where either it's not a good fit or there's a problem or whatever, without obviously going into a lot of detail, how do you approach that? That's typically a difficult thing.
I have had to do that a couple of times in my career, and what works for me is to call the person in and talk about it and just be very frank. And I think it's very important to maintain self-esteem, make sure that they know you value them as a person and what they're wonderful at. However, here's where we have a problem or some concerns, or here's something I'd really like to see go a little bit differently. And so maybe there's a little coaching that goes into that. I see if there's something that I can do to help them. Maybe I'm contributing to how the work is or isn't progressing. So we have a good conversation about it, and we'll probably have a couple of those. And if it's not going to work, then we have to come to that kind of understanding as well, and then proceed from the next strategy or steps. Is there a better fit, as you said, somewhere else in the department, a different role? Because everyone has their strengths, and it is about finding a good fit.
Let's flip it around to people that you have reported to. You mentioned Ron Levine earlier. We can't always pick our bosses or the people that we report to. And also, in your situation, not only do you have somebody that you report to, but you have sort of a larger community, in a sense, or legislators or people that sort of have a stake in what is going on in the division. Could you say a little bit about that relationship? That's more the relationship between you and the person or the entities that you've reported to over the years. What do you look for? What do you hope that will be like?
Well, first you do have to figure out who you are working for. At the local level, I had a board, a marvelous board, a county manager, we had commissioners, you got the public at large, and sometimes you're working for your own staff. And sometimes that's going to change depending on the situation, is who your primary person you're working for. Are you carrying water for your board, or is this for the manager, or who is this for? At the state, there is the legislature, there's the secretary, many of the other stakeholders are the same. It's a little easier for me at the state because I know I work for the secretary, Carmen Hooker Odom. Now, she's fabulous, which is the point for me, is I have to work for someone that I really respect and value, and that I think we are mutually in sync with where we're going. I've not always had that experience. I had a little couple-year gap there where I just had to hang on to the ski rope, is the way I think about it, and do what you need to do when you've got someone that you're working with that you're not quite in sync with. But I think that's real important, to work for someone that shares your values. I try to be sure that we are communicating that I am supporting my leader, making sure they're not caught off guard, making sure they have the information that they need to support me and the work that we're trying to do. I want them to look good too. When they look good, because they're knowledgeable and they're articulate and on point, then the Division of Public Health is going to look good too. So I think keeping them very informed is really important.
Now, you must find every day there's stuff going on in public health in North Carolina. There are all sorts of health problems out there. And one of the rules that somebody once told me was this no surprises thing. Make sure your boss is not surprised by something that goes on. Do you see, you mentioned that sort of in what you were just saying, Leah. How do you play that out? Because there's always a question about what's a surprise and what isn't. But you must have a sort of a rule of thumb that you use to make sure that, in this instance, Carmen knows what's going on, and you know, there's no real surprises as far as she's concerned. Is that something you try to do? Or?
Oh, I try to keep her very informed. If it's, I also try not to overload her with information. If she gets a call from me, she'll take it because she knows I must have something that she needs to know, or I really have to have some information from her. So I'm very careful about how much information I am sharing. I think that you can have a couple of screw-ups. It's more the pattern. Or do you repeatedly let someone down, or is there someone in your shop that is repeatedly just doesn't seem to get it, what you mean by keep me informed? So I think you're looking really more for the pattern.
Let's shift a little bit to this issue of balance. Your job is a very demanding job, a lot going on. I think one of the things that people always want to know about is more on an operational level, how do you say yes and no to specific requests? You're asked to do a lot of things, speak, attend meetings, and so forth. How do you really decide how to spend your time? Because that's obviously a very valuable sort of component. Are there any criteria or techniques that you use just on a daily basis?
Well, there are. The first is the request something that forwards the mission of our division, our work in public health. That would always be the first cut. And the second cut for me would be, is it important for the office of the state health director to make this effort apart? I keep the office and myself very distinct there. And the third would be, who's asking me? Is Dr. Ed Baker asking me to do this? Is there a relationship I need to tend to? Is it a local health director who would be a primary person in my life, or a community-based organization person that really is reaching out and needs me or the state health officer? And I guess after that I would probably think more about, is there someone else that would be better at it than I am? If they don't need me necessarily or need the office, who would be better at that from a content perspective? And then another thing I think is really important to think about is this an opportunity for another leader to grow? One of the people on the staff that would do a good job, that needs that kind of exposure. Should I send Dr. Plesha to the legislature? He's a new chronic disease leader. Should I ask someone else to make this particular presentation? I think that's another thing I would look at.
Could you say a little bit more about the issue of the office? In other words, the position that you hold. Because what I was hearing you say in that second instance was you're thinking about how to advance the role of the state health director, and that's apart from you as a person. I think that's what you were saying. Could you say a little bit more about that? Because I think that's something that's a little bit difficult sometimes for people to fully appreciate.
Well, it is an institution. The Office of the State Health Director is appointed by the Secretary, approved by the Governor. In this state, it is not a political position. It's appointed, but it's been very nonpartisan. I think it's very important to stay that way. So we look at this as not only nonpartisan, but also having a certain amount of regulatory authority. You want to maintain a certain amount of credibility so that the issues that the state health officer speaks to are listened to, credible, science-based, supportive of health and quality of life on a statewide basis. So you sort of pick and choose what you're going to get that office involved in.
And you keep that role in mind in trying to decide about
Always.
how to spend your time.
This is bigger than me.
Right.
I will come, I will go, and I want somebody else really great in there to continue to move North Carolina forward.
Let's talk about balance a little bit. That's always a challenge in positions like yours. How do you find time for renewal, whatever the right words are? What works for you to keep that balance in place?
Well, probably the biggest driver in my life is that I've got a growing 14-year-old at home that will be 18 and gone. So, you know, I put the pens and paper aside and go home to do the dinner thing and the baseball and help with homework. That's really important. And I have a husband. I'd like to stay married, so I have to handle that a little bit, because this kind of job can eat you up, and it's very gratifying. It's almost addicting, and the needs are great. So much opportunity. It's hard to turn that energy and momentum off sometimes. So the family drives a lot of that. Some of it is being able to pace yourself so you can go the distance. You know, I have goals, things I'd like to see accomplished that are going to take a while, so I don't want to burn out. I also think you have to stay rested and have that balance in order to be on point and really energized and excited and engaged. So I find that to be part of my strategy as well. So I do get out of there. I think that's really important.
Great. Well, we've talked about a lot of things, and this has just been a wonderful conversation. If you could emphasize, say, 2 or 3 points out of all the things that you've shared today, what would those be out of all of this about leadership and your thoughts on that?
Well, the first thing probably for me would be that art of the long view, being able to see where you're going and not let today's task take away your vision and your momentum. Not let that email and everybody else's agenda to meet, call, take your long-term view away from you. And the second would be the relationships. It's all about the people, people to people. And third is being able to communicate your vision, your need for others to be a partner in that with you, and why it's going to make a difference. So those are probably the most important 3 for me.
Leah, thank you. This was fantastic. Thanks for taking the time.
My pleasure.